Okay, so now we're getting ready to remove the valve cover, and we need to zip tie some of this stuff out of the way so we can work on it. So these are the ignition wires. I'm going to use a couple of zip ties just to pull them out. Looks like a bit of there. To remove the valve cover, we have to undo several bolts. There are these inner bolts, which secure the valve cover around the spark plugs, and these outer bolts, which secure the valve cover in place over the engine. Gaskets. All right, there we got it. Okay, so we're going to remove the cover, and this takes a 5mm Allen key to remove these bolts. So we'll get that started right now. Our goal today is to get the valve clearances set for the intake and exhaust valves. Once that's done, then we'll get the cover back on. Keep the engine as clean as possible. Once the carbs are rebuilt, we're going to put it back on and start this engine to see if we can get it running properly prior to disassembly of the bike. It looks like it's been used before. A little bit of paint loss on that. I always like to protect my things, so here we can see there's a gasket on this. It's been off before. I'll probably clean that before I put it back on so that it can see correctly. I do have a new gasket for it as well. Bolts go in a separate bag so they don't scratch the cover. This bike is in particularly good condition, so I'm trying to keep it as original as possible. So this is the nut here that we'll use to turn the crankshaft in the correct direction, which will be this way. Now we can set correct timing for each cylinder, top dead center, etc., etc. So once we crank it through, we can start doing the valve clearances. So valve clearances on this particular engine are set right here. On this is an example of it here, and the exhaust valves are up here. Each valve has the same configuration. You've got a cam lobe driving a rocker, which has a threaded bolt through it with a lock nut. Lock nut requires a special tool. So we have the Suzuki manual, and the manual will give us the clearance for the valve adjustment. So periodic maintenance, let's have a look. 2-6 valve clearance. So according to this book, valve clearance is inspected initially at 1,000 kilometers and every 6,000 kilometers after that. Since I just purchased this bike, I'm going to set the valve clearances now. So we set it when it's cold, and the clearances are 0.1 to 0.15 millimeter or 0.004 to 0.006 inches. Now there's some notes here. The cams must be at position A or B. And in the diagram, A is the cam lobe pointing straight up, and B is the cam lobe pointing opposite to the rocker pretty much. Clearance reading should not be taken with the cam in any other position than these two positions. Clearance specification is for a cold state. Turn the crankshaft, be sure to use a 19mm wrench and rotate in the normal running direction. Spark plugs should be removed. So continuing with the spark plugs, Like I said, it's a lot easier to rotate the crankshaft when these are out. Now we have the spark plugs out. Okay folks, so to do this you're going to need this tool. I'll put a link to it down below. It's an 8mm for the larger bolt, and it has the special adapter for this bolt. This tool costs about $25, and it makes adjusting the valves a whole lot easier. You'll need a feeler gauge. Feeler gauge looks like this, and we're going to use 0.005 or 0.1 of an inch or 0.127 millimeter. Specifications call for 0.10 to 0.15 of a millimeter or 0.004 to 0.006 of an inch are the specifications. When doing this, we are looking to position the cam in the correct place. So I'm going to do the exhaust valves here for the number 3 exhaust. And here, the lobe, as you can see, is in the upright position. This is important. The lobe needs to be in the upright or over in this position to correctly adjust these. So we need to decompress these valves as much as possible to set the clearance. So I'll set the feeler gauge in, and this one is loose enough that I can move the gauge around. So we'll set it in place there. We'll take our tool, put it on the valve, put it on the stem. So the tool is now engaged to the stem and engaged to the valve. I'll loosen off the nut and we'll tighten it down. So we'll loosen it off and tighten it down. Now it's too tight. If you look at it, I can't move the feeler gauge, so it is too tight at this time. So I'll back this off a little bit. So there we go. We've backed it off a little bit. Feels pretty good there. There's no slop in it. So that feels pretty good. And you can see how this tool is useful. That's too loose. So we'll tighten it up just a bit. There we go. That feels correct. So again, you want to feel just a little bit of binding on this feeler gauge, just a bit of binding. But you should be able to move it fairly freely. Don't press down on this. If you press down, you'll adjust things incorrectly. If it's too loose, then your tappets will make a lot of noise. So that feels pretty good. So I'm going to hold this in position and tighten the lock nut, like so. Want to make it fairly tight, but not ruining your clearance here. So as you can see, I can still move the feeler gauge under the stud, and that's how you adjust the clearance. So I've loosened, as I mentioned, I've loosened this nut off. This allows me to loosen the stem, bring in the clearance tool like this, and we can check our clearance. So we can tighten this down. Now it's too tight. You can see it's really tight. So loosen it off a little bit, right about there, just a little bit off. I should be able to freely move this around, but it should feel like it's binding slightly, just ever so slightly. So that's the correct position. So I'll hold this tightly, tighten up the lock nut, taking care not to move the stem. So there we have it. We check it afterwards. Feels the same. I can still move it. I can put my feeler gauge, which is 0.127 millimeters, in between the two and move it correctly. The reason for this is when the cam lobe is off the valve, it needs to be in the full upright position to seal the cylinder correctly. So that clearance is kind of critical. If it's too tight, the valve will not seat correctly and it will leak, in this case out the exhaust port, but in the intake port it could back up in the intake port and cause backfiring and various other issues. So this clearance is kind of critical. These older Suzukis, really 5,000 to 6,000 kilometers, this should be done. Cam chain looks good, it's nice and tight. So I think we're good. So Again, the same procedure is used to do every valve. And you've got to rotate the crankshaft to put the cam lobe in the upright position when you do this. I strongly recommend getting a manual. The manual shows you how to do it, how to put everything back together, and to do it correctly. So this video, use it at your own discretion. Remember, cam lobe needs to be rotated into the upper position. So as you can see here, when I rotate the crankshaft, the cam lobe rotates. So there it is, rotating around. See, it compresses the valve springs as the lobe comes up, and then comes off the lobe. And with the cam in the upright position, this is the correct position to set your valve clearances. So the cam lobe should be in the top position, and it's the same for every lobe here. So you'll have to rotate the crank. Rotate it clockwise because that's the way it spins. Don't rotate it backwards, it's not good for it. Okay, so we're going to put the valve cover on. I've installed the gasket right here, which you can see, this gasket. Cleaned it, installed it. It is the original gasket for now. I do have a new one. Once the engine comes out, I'll replace it at that time. For now, we're just getting everything ready so we can run this engine. So this is the engine valve cover. We're going to install this right now. It's a little bit complicated to get it in, but it will protect the valves. So let's get underway. So you can see it's just about in position. So this gasket needs to go into this valve cover. So it's a little bit tricky to thread it into position. Okay. No pinching anywhere, so we'll double check. It's flat. Nice and flat all the way in the correct position. Correct position. And the frame is in the correct position. So the front's all correct. It's seated correctly all the way around. Good. So these bolts, I will probably replace these once I paint the engine because they're looking a little worn. I need an extension for that. These bolts They seal the gaskets around the spark plugs so that oil doesn't leak into the spark plug containers. So we've installed these two bolts, two here, and these seal gaskets around the spark plugs. We've tightened these down to seal the valve cover gasket, so that's done. Oil return lines are next. There's no real gasket on those, just an O-ring. For now, we're just going to do it back up because we do want to run this. I hope that you enjoyed watching this video on how to set your valve clearances. There are different ways to do this, and this is just one way. Again, my advice is to get the manual, follow the manual step by step, and that's the proper way to do it. So hopefully this has been a little bit informative and a little bit helpful, and good luck.